Bueno, muchas gracias a todos los presentes. Hay muchas cosas que decir y no soy yo el protagonista de esta tarde, lo queremos escuchar a Dan. En primer lugar, bienvenidos a todos. Les doy la bienvenida a la conferencia que va a dictar el profesor Dan Zahavi. En primer lugar, me gustaría agradecerle a la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras el esfuerzo organizativo. Aquí hay varias de las autoridades, en particular al Departamento de Filosofía y Letras, que está detrás de esta actividad, y en especial a su director, Juan Torbidoni, quien ha estado colaborando en esta organización. Esta actividad la organizamos en el marco del CEF, del Centro de Estudios Filosóficos, y se inscribe en el marco de una serie de encuentros que está dando el profesor Zahavi en distintas instituciones a lo largo de todo el mes de marzo. Comenzó hace unos días, el 5, con una actividad dedicada a su libro Bingui, un workshop que hicimos, continuará después del 12, hoy el 20, lo anuncio también por si hay interesados, en la Academia Nacional de Ciencias, aquí en Buenos Aires también. Va a ser una actividad de todo el día, dedicada, va a ser un congreso sobre la vida en común, desde la perspectiva fenomenológica. También nos va a acompañar Sophie Lloyd-Dolt en ese evento, que de vuelta, si quieren información y demás, va a ser posteado regularmente ya cerca de la fecha. Y el 25 también una conferencia de ambos en Puan, en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de la UBA, en temáticas también vinculadas en las que vienen desarrollando su trabajo. Hoy, como saben, el título que nos va a trabajar es Empatía, moralidad y cuidado. Bueno, la conferencia de hoy, simplemente por cuestiones operativas, les comento cómo se va a desarrollar. Va a tener, en primer lugar, la exposición del profesor Dan Zahavi con una presentación para que puedan seguir. Todo, como saben, es en inglés, pero es muy accesible y creo que no vamos a tener problema. Después van a continuar los comentarios del profesor Luis Rabanaque, que es, como saben, profesor de la casa, muy querido, que va a comentar la conferencia de la exposición que va a realizar el profesor Zahavi, y a partir de ahí se va a dar un diálogo en el cual después finalmente abriremos al público para las preguntas que ustedes quieran hacer, ya a modo de finalización, ¿sí? Más o menos calculamos que el evento durará 1 hora y media, 2 horas según el interés. Dejo al profesor Luis Rabanaque para que haga la presentación del profesor Dan Zahavi, al cual le damos una gran bienvenida a UCA.
Bueno, si no les molesta, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. En primer lugar, voy a conmutar idioma, si les parece. Vamos a hacer la presentación completa en lengua inglesa. Así el profesor Zahavi también se entera de lo que voy a decir ahora. So that you also know what I'm going to say right now. So, voy a hacer una pequeña presentación y ya luego le dejamos la palabra al profesor Zahavi. Profesor Dan Zahavi es he is professor of philosophy and director of the Center of Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen, like that, in Denmark. His primary research area is phenomenology and philosophy of mind, and their intersection with empirical disciplines such as psychiatry and psychology. In addition to a number of scholarly works on the phenomenology of Husserl, Professor Zahavi has mainly written on the nature of selfhood, self-consciousness, intersubjectivity, empathy, and most recently on topics on social ontology. Since 2020, Professor Zahavi is the principal investigator on a research project entitled Who Are We? Philosophy and the Social Sciences, which is supported by the European Research Council and the Carlsberg Foundation. His writings have been translated into more than 30 languages, 32, I think. Update. His works are too many to make a mention, so I will only briefly mention some of the more important books. Husserl and the Transcendental Intersubjectivity, in German first, then in English. Self-Awareness and Alterity, 100 Years of Phenomenology, as editor. Subjectivity and Selfhood, Phenomenology for Beginners, in German. The Phenomenological Mind, together with Professor Sean Gallagher. This work is translated into Spanish. It was written in 2008, second edition 2012, and the next year was translated in Spanish. Husserl's Phenomenology, Self and the Other, exploring subjectivity, empathy, and shame. Husserl's Legacy, Phenomenology, Metaphysics, and Transcendental Philosophy. And, as already mentioned by Francisco, Being We, Phenomenological Contributions to Social Ontology, which is brand new work. It appeared last year and was presented in the Academia de Ciencias last week, exactly a week ago. So, I shut up and I let Professor Zahavi begin. Please.
Thank you so much. I think before starting on my lecture, I just want to express my gratitude for the invitation to all the organizers. This is my first visit to this university, and I'm very honored by the invitation. I'm looking forward to both the comments from Professor Ravanake, but also hopefully the kind of dialogue we might all have afterwards. So to start, if we can get this to work. There is a common conception of empathy, according to which empathy is what allows us to take in the perspective of others and as a result also experience the world as it is for others. And in that capacity, it can work as a force against selfishness and indifference. And given that conception, it also stands to reason that empathy is something that we should nurture, it's something we should expand. I mean, a high degree of empathy is ultimately crucial if we want to lead a moral life. So this is a common conception, and one can find a number of prominent figures speaking of empathy in this vein. So Obama, one point, said that the empathy deficit in the US was a more pressing political problem than the federal deficit. And Rifkin, the social theorist Rifkin, using a somewhat extravagant language, basically argued that in order to revitalize the biosphere, we need to expand our empathic consciousness, we need to allow empathy to flourish on a global scale. Now, given these kinds of assertions and given this widespread view that empathy is to some extent the key to solving societal problems, it is perhaps not so surprising that there has been a certain skeptical pushback. And I want to start this talk by taking a look at some of these critics. First, a couple of anthropologists, they both happen to be Danish, Niels Buband and Rane Willerslev, and then the Yale psychologist Paul Bloom. Now, Buband and Willerslev, they published an article about 10 years ago called The Dark Side of Empathy, Mimesis, Deception, and the Magic of Alterity. And what they claim to be doing in that article is to defend some very novel, some very provocative ideas about the role of empathy. As they point out, empathy is actually, and contrary to the widespread view, is actually not always a moral virtue. Because our ability to be able to imagine how others see and experience the world can also be used for nefarious purposes. It can be used to deceive, to manipulate others. So it's not just about promoting mutual understanding, compassion, and social cohesion. No, there is a dark side to empathy. And as Buband and Willerslev argue in the article, I mean, this is a feature that, in their words, have been almost entirely overlooked, because existing literature, again, on their view, have completely overlooked to what extent empathy is active in deception. So this is basically Buband and Willerslev. What about Paul Bloom? Well, he initially wrote a target article in Boston Review called Against Empathy, that kind of summarizes his main ideas, and this was then enlarged in a very well sold book. I mean, it was the kind of book that you can find in airport bookshops. I guess for some this is the ultimate goal of our academic lives, to have our books displayed in such locations, called Against Empathy. And Paul Bloom basically made a couple of claims in these publications. So first of all, he argued that empathy is biased. What does that mean? It basically means that we have a much easier time empathizing with those whose needs are salient, those who are close by, and those who are like ourselves. Moreover, empathy concerns our relationship to specific individuals. And the obvious point here is that if we really want to promote impartiality and fairness also on a political level, also on a global level, it's very unclear what role empathy can actually play. I mean, this is the argument by Bloom, I mean, isn't a keen sense of justice and the development of a sense of moral obligation, I mean, is that not much more relevant than spurious empathic skills if we want to make the world a better place, and if we want to promote policies that affects large groups of people? So this was the first kind of argument Bloom made, but he also made a second argument where he said, well, even if we acknowledge that empathy is primarily active in close interpersonal relations, well, even there it is overrated. Why is that the case? Well, because when we empathize with somebody who is in pain or distressed, the outcome of our empathic kind of skills is basically that we then come to feel what that person is feeling. And if we come to feel the same as the person who is distressed or in pain, if that's what happens, well, then it's not obvious that that is actually a good thing for the person who is suffering. I mean, if I'm in pain or if I'm distressed, and if I go to a doctor or if I go to a psychologist, I mean, I want the psychologist, the doctor to be calm and confident. I don't want the person to be overwhelmed by negative emotions, because if that were to happen, one could very likely then see the doctor or psychologist at some point starting to be more concerned with his or her own distress and pain rather than with mine. And again, that's not to my benefit. So ultimately, and I mean, I think the arguments in the book, which was also written for a larger audience, perhaps got, was boosted somewhat, perhaps also a little bit beyond what the actual arguments were supposed to show. But ultimately, Bloom ends up arguing that empathy is one of the leading motivators of inequality and immorality in society. He argued that empathy is an irrational emotion that appeals to our narrow prejudices, and that it leads to a distortion of our judgments and to cruelty. And so ultimately, and I mean, that's the explanation for the title of the book, without empathy, the decisions we would make would be clearer, fairer, and more moral, which of course, I mean, are all very provocative statements. So limiting our impulse towards empathy is really the most compassionate choice we could ever make. Now, what should be clear already at this stage is that the discussion of empathy is fairly confusing. Because if you paid attention to what I was saying, it should be clear already now that Bloom and Buband and Willerslev are not really talking about the same thing when they are talking about empathy. For Bloom, empathy is defined as a form of affective sharing. I mean, to empathize with somebody in distress is basically to come to have the same experience, or at least the same kind of experience as the person in question. So again, the definition of empathy is to come to feel what the other is feeling. And in the technical literature, this is often presented as the view that empathy amounts to isomorphic states in empathizer or target, to put it more non-technically, that there's a match between the kind of emotional states of the empathizer and the states of the target of empathy. Now, for Buber and Willerslev, by contrast, empathy is primarily defined as a question of imaginative perspective taking. So empathy is about, imagining what it would be like to be in the other's shoes, to use that kind of formulation. And I mean, what is clear from that just very short overview is a more widespread feature of contemporary discussions of empathy, which is basically that the discussion is quite confusing. Not only do people operate with a variety of different notions of empathy, and here I have listed some of them: mirror empathy, motor empathy, affective empathy, reenactive empathy, cognitive empathy. But it's also the case that even when it comes to those concepts, people often have conflicting definitions of what the concepts mean. Now, if we just stay with this list, I mean, the two most prevalent notions that one finds again and again in the contemporary debate is basically the divide between affective and cognitive empathy. And I think that is to a large extent also the divide we see exemplified in Bloom on the one hand, affective empathy, and Buber and Willerslev on the other, because what they primarily are talking about is cognitive empathy. Now, if that is correct, I mean, if Buber and Willerslev are primarily talking about cognitive empathy, which is often also discussed in terms of perspective taking or mind reading, I mean, if that is what they are talking about, well, then one would have to say that what they present as a very novel, provocative claim, namely that cognitive empathy can be used for manipulative purposes, is a triviality. Because that everybody would agree that mind reading or perspective taking can, of course, be used for those purposes. I mean, so there's nothing, really nothing novel in the claim. I would, however, say that if one sticks to the definitions that Bloom and Buber and Willerslev have been using, I think they are right in problematizing a kind of easy identification between empathy and morality. I mean, if empathy is defined either simply as coming to have the same kind of emotion as the target, or if empathy is defined as this imagined perspective taking, I mean, then it's not obvious that simply having empathy already, guarantees pro-social behavior or morality. Now, what I want to do in the following is basically to present you with an alternative take on empathy, one that I am more in line with. It's a debate and a discussion and an investigation of empathy that precedes all these more recent discussions. It's the one can find back in early phenomenology. And it actually also presents one of the very first philosophical discussions of empathy. So I mean, I think that there are different reasons why I think it makes sense to return to that definition and that discussion. And after having presented that, I then want to return to the question about the link between empathy and morality. I mean, if we kind of decided to opt for the phenomenological discussion or phenomenological take on empathy, what would then be the outcome when it concerns this link or this relationship between empathy and morality? Now, if we go back and kind of start with some of these very early initial understandings of empathy, I mean, there's one person one has to introduce, and that is Theodor Lipps. Theodor Lipps, who was an influential German philosopher and psychologist in Munich, and who, from the perspective of the history of phenomenology, is also of some interest because many of his former students who at some point kind of betrayed him by basically leaving him and going to Göttingen to study with Husserl. So many of the very early phenomenologists were actually former students of Lipps. Now, the reason why Lipps is of interest in this specific context is that he was the one who introduced the term empathy into the social cognition debate. And I mean, there is, the German term for empathy is Einfühlung. And the term Einfühlung is a fairly novel construction. It was introduced by German aestheticists working on aesthetics in the 1870s. And when it was initially used as an explanation of the kind of psychological processes that are involved when one appreciates a work of art as somehow harboring psychological or emotional dimensions. So I mean, to look at a picture and somehow see it as vigorous or tragic. The question is, how is that possible? How can we somehow view what is ultimately an object? How can we view an object as somehow possessing psychological properties? And the term Einfühlung was introduced to explain that. And it was then Lipps who, around 1905, then started to use the same term, Einfühlung, as a label for what goes on in interpersonal understanding. And it was then Lipps's discussion that was picked up by the American psychology Titchener in his lectures on the experimental psychology of thought process in 1909. And it was Titchener who then translated it as empathy. So again, I'm just out of historical interest. I just think it's important to emphasize that empathy, Einfühlung, are very recent concepts. So it's not as if they have a very, very long philosophical tradition. I mean, a concept that has a much longer tradition is sympathy, but not empathy. I mean, it's really fairly recent, and it's a very technical concept. Now, what did Lipps understand by this concept? Well, he used the term in a way that was somewhat different from how it's used today. He basically argued that it constitutes a modality of knowledge sui generis. And to understand what he has in mind here, I think it's kind of informative just to make the following kind of repetition. So Lipps was saying that knowledge can pertain to three different dimensions. There are three different realms of knowledge. There's knowledge about external reality, about external objects, and the main source for that knowledge is perception. Then there's knowledge of our own mind, and the main source for that knowledge is introspection. And then there's knowledge of other minds, and the main source for that knowledge is empathy. So what is important, I think, is to see that for Lipps, at least in his initial discussion, I mean, empathy was introduced as an epistemic notion. It kind of was a label for a specific process of understanding. It didn't have any pro-social or moral connotations. I mean, this is really something that only kind of came into the discussion later on. Now, I don't have time to go into the kind of more technical details about Lipps's understanding of empathy, but there are two things I want to highlight because these two things were kind of features that phenomenologists would subsequently kind of object to. Now, what was very important for Lipps's understanding was basically the idea that empathy is facilitated by a mixture of mimicry and projection. And one implication of that was, and he is very explicit about that, is that ultimately I can only come to understand others insofar as they are having experiences which I've had myself. So I cannot really recognize anything in the other unless I have first projected it into the other on the basis of my own prior experiences. And this, of course, puts a very severe limit on the accomplishment of empathy. I mean, empathy is not really something that can expand our horizon. It's not something that can really learn us something new. No, empathy is really linked to, again, this issue of projection. And what we find in, so again, Lips were writing these things in the first decade of the 20th century. And what we very quickly find, I mean, perhaps also because these people all were familiar with Lips, are then reactions and responses to Lips's account. And again, out of time constraints, I won't go into a kind of nitty-gritty discussion of how Husserl, Scheler, and Stein, how their view on empathy differed. I'm kind of adopting a slightly more kind of Eagle's perspective on this, and I want to highlight or extract what I take to be commonalities between their different views. But I mean, just to point to some relevant sources, so we have Husserl, I mean, the 3 volumes to intersubjectivity, especially the first volume contains these discussions of Lips. This is Husserliana 13, then there's Scheler's Wesen und Formen der Sympathie, and Stein's Zum Problem der Einfühlung. And so what do we find here? Well, just again, to give you just some paraphrases, for all of them, empathy amounts to a basic form of other understanding. And so they accept that idea of Lips. I mean, that empathy has a certain epistemic role to play. It is about understanding the other. It's not about morality. It's not about pro-social action. It's about understanding others. They accept that. But what they reject, as I just mentioned a moment ago, is the attempt by him to explain empathy in terms of imitation and projection. And so here, again, just some paraphrases of central claims of theirs. This is primarily from Husserl's Ideas 2. Husserl writes that the mindedness of the other, his thinking, feeling, desiring, is intuitively present in the gestures, the intonation, and in the facial expressions. The expressivity of the other is imbued with psychological meaning from the start, and that it's empathy that allows us to understand and grasp this psychological meaning. Scheler, in turn, used the term Fremdwahrnehmung, the perception of others, and even entitled his own theory, a perceptual theory of other minds. So there's again this idea. I mean, one way to understand that is that Scheler is pointing to the existence of something we could call social perception, that our understanding of others, there's something perceptual about that. And finally, we find Stein arguing that empathy, I mean, is a sui generis form of intentionality. It's the type of intentionality that targets other experiencing subjects. It's the basic cognitive source for that understanding. It's not as if there are not other ways of understanding others, but empathy is the most basic and the most fundamental form. And I think that one way to, perhaps, I mean, in a one-liner, extract the commonality between these 3 views is basically to view empathy as a form of Ausdrucksverstehen, a kind of expressive understanding. It's very much geared towards bodily expressivity, and it basically designates the experiential encounter with somebody else's embodied and embedded experience. So the idea here is also that, I mean, the life of the other's mind is not hidden in some kind of unreachable inner sphere. No, the mind of the other and the mind of everybody is also expressed. And insofar as it is bodily expressed, we can have some kind of experience of it. So that might all sound, I mean, I don't know, perhaps a little bit, still a bit abstract. Let me give a very concrete, very simple illustration of what I think is at stake here. So let's compare two different scenarios. So in the first scenario, you're visiting a friend. He happens to have just left his house for a moment to buy some groceries. So you're alone in his house and you walk around. You enter his office. And then you discover that on his desk, I mean, all the letters, well, at least a lot of letters from his ex-wife have been torn to pieces. Now, you also happen to know that he recently was divorced. And on the basis of those pieces of information, you then infer that your friend is probably distressed. So that's a way of coming to understand the psychological life of another. It's an inferential way of doing that on the basis of certain pieces of evidence. Then compare that to a situation where you're standing face to face with your friend. Suddenly he breaks down. He displays his distress in his anguish, in his pain countenance, in the tonality of his voice. Here you also have an experience of his distress. But I would argue, I mean, even if the, so to speak, the aim or the object in both of these scenarios are the same, it's a certain comprehension of the distress of your friend, I would still, claim that these provides us with two very different ways of grasping the distress of your friend. In the first case, it's inferential. In the other case, it's much more perceptual, much more immediate. And so the claim made by many of the phenomenologists was precisely this, that what empathy confronts you with is the here and now presence of an experience that is not your own. But to put it differently, and again, I think that kind of sentence, I think also summarizes really the view you can find defended by Stein and Scheler and Husserl and many others. In the empathic face-to-face encounter, you can have a certain acquaintance with the other's experiential life that has a directness and immediacy to it that is just not possessed by beliefs, cognitive beliefs you might have about the other in his or her absence. So again, the claim is not that we cannot come to understand others in all kinds of ways. I mean, they're not saying that empathy is the only way, but they would say that empathy, again, provides, there's something experiential about empathy that just makes it different in character from me having more abstract, detached beliefs about the psychological state of people who are far away. Or, I could also, one way to reach those, beliefs about people who are not currently present would be inferential. Another option would be for me to engage in perspective taking. I could use my imagination. I could imagine what would it be like for me to be in such a situation and then somehow project the finding onto the other. Again, none of them are saying that that can't happen. The claim is just that there is something else that is also possible and a very fundamental part of everyday life, and that is this empathic, embodied, face-to-face encounter. So again, I mean, to some extent, the idea is very simple, and I find it useful to allude to a classical distinction that we find in Husserl's theory of intentionality. So Husserl basically makes the case that we can intend objects in different ways. He uses a distinction between signative, pictorial, or intuitive modes of understanding. So I can think about the Tower of Pisa. I mean, I can formulate a sentence involving the Tower of Pisa. I know Tower of Pisa is the most, famous tower in the western part of Italy. That's about the Tower of Pisa. I'm referring to the Tower of Pisa. The Tower of Pisa is my object, my intentional object, but it's all very abstract, it's very symbolic. Compare that to the situation where, again, I'm focusing on the Tower of Pisa, but now I'm trying to imagining it. or I'm trying to, I'm looking at a picture of it, I'm still presented with the Tower of Pisa, but in a way that is very different from simply thinking abstractly about it. Now it's somehow more concretely given, either in virtue of my visualization or in terms of actually seeing a photo of the tower. And then again, compare that to actually standing in front of the Tower of Pisa. Now it's there. It is there in the here and now. It has a different kinds of presence than in the case of imagination or depiction or mere thinking. So this is a very classical distinction by Husserl. And the proposal would now be, let's try to just apply that to the case of social understanding as well. So, I can think about Anne's nervousness. I can formulate a sentence about, Anne's nervousness being very common or very frequent or whatever. And then I'm thinking about Anne's nervousness. It's the psychological state of somebody else that I'm somehow focusing on. That is still different from me imagining Anne's nervousness, me trying to imagine what it might be like for her to, be homeless or without a job or whatever situation it is that she's currently facing. And that would, it will start to flesh out the nervousness in some way. But that, the argument would be still different from actually standing face to face with Anne's nervousness and perceiving or intuiting it or empathizing with it in the concrete face-to-face encounter. In the latter case, again, the nervousness has a different presence. It is given as here and now in a manner that is different from what is the case in imagination and mere thinking. So that's basically, one way of cashing out what the phenomenologist wants to argue for. And it should be noted that for the phenomenologist, empathy is not just about affective resonance. It's not just about being able to perceive, empathize with the affective states of others. No, rather it concerns our general ability to access the life of the mind of others in their expressions, expressive behavior, and meaningful actions. So that's one way to try to make it clearer to you what the phenomenological proposal might amount to. Another way of doing the same is by looking at views that the phenomenologist would reject. And let's look at two obvious candidates. So the first candidate would be the claim defended by Buber and Willerslev that empathy amounts to imaginative perspective taking or imaginative other-oriented perspective taking, but sometimes one makes a distinction there as well. Doesn't really need to bother us at the moment. The phenomenologists would say, this is just unwarranted because empathy and imaginative perspective taking are simply two different things. They can occur, this would be the main argument for why they are not identical. They can occur independently of each other. If you break down and I'm picking up on your emotional distress, that does not have to be accompanied by me at the same time running through an imaginative procedure to figure out what you might be feeling given, the context you're located within. And likewise, I might engage in imaginative perspective taking vis-a-vis what do I know, long dead persons. I might try to imagine what it would be like for Caesar to cross the Rubicon, but whatever the accomplishment of that imaginative exercise amounts to, it will not give me the kind of experiential understanding that empathy provides. So, again, the argument is not that there's not something like imaginative perspective taking, but to claim that it is the same as empathy is just to blur some really important distinctions. That would be the argument of the phenomenologists. The other account to look at is of course, the claim that empathy amounts to affective sharing, because that's Bloom's definition. Now, it should be noted that this is a fairly widespread view. Bloom is not the only one to argue like that. I mean, we have Stephen Darwall claiming that empathy involves a sharing of the other's mental states, or this T and Lam, these are two social neuroscientists, arguing that a crucial component of empathy is the affective sharing between self and other. So I mean, that's, again, it can definitely be found in the literature, this idea that empathy amounts to affective sharing. Now, one thing to initially point out, and I mean, this is partly a comment that is also based on my recent, I mean, extensive, work on collective intentionality or shared intentionality, is that people who are arguing that empathy amounts to affective sharing, I mean, they basically never define what they mean by sharing. And sharing is a very what's the term? Slippery. Sharing is a very slippery term because, I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, sharing a bottle of wine, or sharing a cake, or a meal, or a taxi, or a toothbrush. I mean, these are all different types of sharing. I mean, again, if we share a toothbrush, it's one and the same toothbrush that we are supposedly sharing with temporal distance. If we share a bottle of wine, well, each of us will have our own part of the wine. I mean, I can't drink the part that you are drinking. So all I'm just saying is, well, I mean, there's something here in the notion of sharing that actually needs to be spelled out in order for us to even understand what the proposal amounts to. I mean, if empathy amounts to affective sharing, what kind of sharing is meant? And typically, I mean, this is not addressed by people who defend this view, and often what they end up saying is just, I mean, they basically say, well, it's effective sharing in the sense that there is some kind of similarity between the emotion of one and the emotion of another. And I mean, just for the record, I mean, that clearly is not sufficient for sharing, because somebody in Berlin could right now, I don't know, feel a certain, tiredness in his foot soles because he has been standing up for long. So do I. So we have somewhat similar experiences. Does that mean that we are sharing anything? I find that totally ridiculous, because, I mean, we have no contact, we have no awareness of each other. So just saying that there's sharing going on because there's some similarity between the two, I think won't work. But anyway, more fundamentally speaking, I think what the phenomenologists would say is basically the following: empathy can occur without affective sharing, and so for that reason they can't be identical. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So imagine a situation where you have a colleague that you really despise. He has just been promoted, he has just received the letter of his promotion, he's smiling, and you're looking at him, you're picking up his happiness, but you're not happy at all. I mean, you are deeply depressed by the fact that you were passed over, and that he got the promotion instead. So the fact that you have very negative emotions doesn't prevent you from having an empathic grasp of his happiness in the here and now. Or take the example of, you're walking down a dark alley, suddenly you see a guy running towards you with a baseball bat, his face is contorted in fury. Now, do you pick up the fury? I mean, or do you have to start engaging in imaginative perspective taking to figure out what emotion might be motivating him? I would say, well, you see his fury there and then, and I think that precondition for you picking up the fury is not that you yourself is furious. I mean, you might very well, again, have the opposite emotion. You might be fearful. The fact that you are currently feeling fear it's not an obstacle for you picking up his fury. What about this example? I mean, where you catch the loving glance that your friend is throwing at his wife. I mean, it's a precondition for your empathically grasping that your friend is loving his wife. Is that you love his wife as well? Seems like a strange, claim to make. And finally, and again, this is a bit related to more recent work I've done. I mean, one of the features, there are different types of empathy also for the phenomenologists, but I mean, one standard case of empathy is unilateral empathy. You are attending to, observing somebody else and empathically grasping what that person is somehow expressing. And that can happen without the person in question having any awareness of your participation or attention. So empathy can be unilateral, but I would argue that sharing, properly speaking, has to be mutual, has to be bidirectional, in order really to count as sharing. So I think that yet another reason for not simply conflating these concepts. So basically, to wrap this part up, as I've said, there are two widespread definitions of empathy. Empathy is affective sharing. To empathize with somebody is to come to feel what that other person is feeling. Or empathy as imaginative perspective taking. To empathize with somebody is to imagine what it would be like to be in the other's shoes. What we find in phenomenology is a very different proposal. So phenomenologists would say, we shouldn't just conflate empathy with sharing, with perspective taking, with sympathy or compassion. All of those, these are all different phenomena. And empathy, is something special, something distinct. We need conceptual distinction and clarity here. Importantly, and this will be important for what follows. Empathy is not about me having the same state as you, nor is it about some kind of fusion, which again is something one occasionally can read about in the empathy literature. No, empathy for the phenomenologists is about me being acquainted with an experience that is not my own. And this insistence on the difference between us is really crucial, I think, for how the phenomenologists conceive of empathy. It's an experiential engagement with the other. I hope that should already be clear. And again, what is very important here, it's not about blurring the border between us. It's not about, making us more similar. It's really about preserving and respecting that difference. And so I think that, again, for the phenomenologists, empathy is it's very crucial for this recognition of the appreciation of the difference between self and other. And in Husserl, you can occasionally find claims to the effect that consciousness in empathy really is confronted with a completely new kind of otherness. The otherness of somebody else's mind for Husserl has a very different kind of transcendence and alterity than the otherness of inanimate objects. And he highlights that in his discussion of empathy. Okay, so back to the starting question. Given this description, what should we say when it comes to the link between empathy and morality? Should we? Again, we saw what Bloom and Willerslev argued. But now I presented you with an account of empathy that's really very different from the accounts that they were favoring. And should that then also make us, reach a different verdict? So, first thing to say is that whatever it is that Buban and Willerslev and Bloom are criticizing, it's clearly not the phenomenological account. That's simply not what they are talking about. To that extent, their criticism also doesn't target what the phenomenologists are saying. One could say, in and of itself that is a problem, because given how influential and how early the phenomenologists were actually thinking about these things, why do recent critics of empathy completely ignore, the historical work that has been done on these concepts? for one, because again, remember, what was it that Bloom and Buber and Willerslev were reacting against? I mean, they were reacting against the idea that empathy is already pro-social, is already kind of, that it already contains moral, moral significance. But I mean, none of the phenomenologists would argue that. I mean, they would not say that empathy is intrinsically pro-social. They would never say that it's sufficient for morality. And in Scheler, you even find the argument that cruelty presupposes empathy. So the argument he makes is basically that if you were not able to pick up on the expressive mindedness of another, I mean, you could not be cruel vis-a-vis the other. And I mean, it's not super clear what he has in mind, but perhaps one possible kind of example one could think of would be a very, very severe case. I mean, that has been reported in the clinical literature, a very severe case of autism. I mean, so if we imagine, I mean, one can wonder whether this is clinically correct, but I mean, let's imagine a person who basically are incapable of recognizing the difference between inanimate objects and other subjects. For such a person, I mean, it would not make any sense to say that such a person would be cruel, because there's nothing, it's not about overriding, the autonomy of the other and doing that on purpose. It's not about inflicting pain on somebody else on purpose, because there's no appraisal that there's even pain present in the first place. And so Scheler would argue that, I mean, rather than empathy disallowing for cruelty or being an obstacle to cruelty, Scheler actually argues, no, it's a precondition. Now, from the fact that empathy is not sufficient, I think, however, it would be too quick to conclude that it doesn't have a role to play. And I think one obvious argument to make would be the following. I mean, if we did not have empathy, if we lacked a basic experiential grasp of others as co-subjects, I actually think it would impede our capacity to identify targets of moral action. So I think our moral life, another way to put this is that our moral life would look very, very different if we actually did not possess something like empathy. To that extent, it has a role to play, even if it's not sufficient. And I think, I mean, I like what a colleague and friend of mine, John Drummond, once put it, where he said that empathy can kind of open a moral space in which respect is located by recognizing the otherness of the other. This is not already to say that it leads to morality, but it opens the space where something like morality can occur. Now, I think that is correct. I think that empathy might serve as, if you will, an important preparatory role. But of course, one should also, I mean, here again, Scheler's example will be relevant. I mean, one would also, I mean, so the space of morality is to some extent also the space of immorality. So what empathy opens up is basically a space where we can both treat the other in a morally respectable manner, but it's also a space where we can commit immoral acts. So again, the line between empathy and morality is not straightforward. So I mean, this was the example that I just mentioned from Scheler. So I think that one thing one could initially say is that even though empathy is not insignificant for morality, the precise role is still somewhat ambiguous because, I mean, it opens up a certain space that can then be used or abused. I mean, both possibilities are present. Now, what I want to end up with is one more concrete suggestion that really looks at the clinical relevance, and where I will, if you will, make a slightly more positive plaidoyer for attending to empathy. So might empathy again have a relevance in a clinical context? And if it is, or if it does, and this is of course something that has been extensively discussed in recent years, might it then be something that can be trained? I don't know what the case is at this university, but in one of the Danish universities, University of Southern Denmark, I think the medical students actually have a certain compulsory course where they spend time reading, because of course that could be misunderstood. Of course, medical students read in general. What I meant was that they also read novels, because there is this idea promoted by some of the teachers at that course that engaging with literature is actually something that might also empower us or develop our empathic skills. And the reason for the course being compulsory is a certain tests or measurements that seem to suggest a certain kind of empathy burnout between medical students at the beginning of their study and at the end of the study. And that's of course not super positive. And so this course was introduced as a kind of counter move. That was a little bit of digression. All I just meant to say was that there is a lot of focus on this question of whether empathy can be trained. Now, if we arrive to that question with the phenomenological account of empathy that I've introduced you to, I think it's a little bit difficult to see how empathy might be trained, because empathy is viewed as this sui generis form of intentionality, a bit like we have imagination, we have recollection, we have perception, we have empathy. It's a very fundamental kind of feature of our cognitive makeup. Whereas I can decide whether or not I want to care about something, whether I want to feel compassionate vis-a-vis them, it seems much less obvious that I can actually choose whether or not I want to empathize with them in the basic sense. It goes against a very fundamental capacity. And so if that was the case, well then healthcare personnel, including nurses, they are constantly using empathy. It's an indispensable guide in daily interaction. And so again, one could say, okay, but what is then, how could it possibly be trained? But I want to actually make an argument that perhaps it can be, but in a somewhat different way than normally understood. Because it's not so much about giving us a skill we didn't already have. It's about learning us to use that skill rather than letting it immediately being overruled by certain other ways of coming to understand others. And let me try to illustrate what I mean by that. So I've already mentioned a couple of times that social cognition and social understanding can come in many different forms. And let's imagine that a certain person has recently been paralyzed as a result of a traffic accident. And if we want to offer proper health care, it seems crucial to figure out how is that patient currently coping with his new life situation. We need some understanding of his psychological life. How do we obtain that? Well, there seems to be different options. We can engage in some kind of inferential mind reading, we can engage in imaginative perspective taking, and we can use face-to-face encounter. And here I want to introduce you to a concept that I initially learned about when I was working a little bit on locked-in syndrome, which, as you probably know, is this condition where you're basically paralyzed with the exception of the ability to blink with your, I think it's left eye, but you're really paralyzed. And the interesting finding was, and this was very much a surprise to me, was that there was a huge mismatch also in that field between the assessment of external observers about the life quality of the patients finding themselves in this condition and the patients themselves when asked. I mean, the patients themselves, even people with locked-in syndrome, actually, and I'll explain to you in a moment how that happened. I mean, even they described having very good or even excellent quality of life. So the point was that, you know, if you asked, you know, family members or clinical personnel, you know, what the attitude was vis-a-vis living a life with, I mean, paralyzed. I mean, many of them would say something like, you know, if that were to happen, I mean, I would want to have life support, you know, cut. I mean, I would not want to live such a life. Now, if you ask the patients, and I mean, the tricky thing, of course, with locked-in syndrome patients is that it's very cumbersome to have a communication with them. And so, I mean, the tragic story here is that initially many people were misdiagnosed. I mean, they were viewed as being comatose, as basically being, you know, vegetables, whereas actually they were completely cognitively functioning. They just couldn't move. And I mean, the first way of corresponding with them was then to, you know, present them with letters, and then, you know, they should blink their eye. I mean, the moment somebody discovered that, you know, apparently something was going on, then people came up with this idea of presenting them with letters where they would then blink and then they would slowly spell words and sentences. I mean, I'm sure that now probably there might be all kinds of computer-aided technologies that makes it much easier. But what the patients were reporting was that in the period where they had no communication with others, that was absolutely terrible. I mean, imagine, you know, again, now I'm asking you to use your imagination, even though part of the point I want to make is that we shouldn't use our imagination, but still try to use your imagination, you know, in what would it be like, I mean, to be treated as a vegetable by caretakers and personnel while you were completely, again, cognitively awake. So they were describing that phase as terrible, but the moment communicative channels were established, I mean, the life quality, I mean, increased dramatically. And I mean, there are these amazing descriptions to be found on the internet, and it is a bit perplexing. I mean, but there are even people who report that being, you know, ending up in this condition was the best thing that had ever happened to them. I mean, you know, how could they possibly say that? But the person I'm now quoting was a guy who ended up writing several books. And in his description, he said, well, before I got this affliction, I was basically wasting my life. I mean, I was partying, I was taking drugs. Now I'm writing books, and you find that extremely, you know, meaningful and rewarding. And his point was, he would never have done that. There would never have been that change of, you know, life perspective had it not been for the fact of him suddenly finding himself with locked-in syndrome condition. So anyway, all I want to say is there seems to be, you know, a difference between how people assess somebody when using imagination, when using theory, and actually trying to engage with the person, getting their point of view. And in the disability paradox literature, I mean, there is then this argument that if I try to understand the other on the basis of prior theoretical knowledge or imaginary perspective taking, well, there is a certain risk that I am really doing away with or violating the other's perspective because I'm not taking it seriously. I'm just imposing my own view or my own preferences on the patient. And so, again, imaginary perspective taking, you know, might in some cases really be nothing but the imposition of one's own view upon the other. Now, that whole literature, I mean, it's also literature that, that whole discussion is also a discussion that has occurred in debates that doesn't really have anything to do with empathy. And this is also the case with this quote by Elisabeth Spellman. So she doesn't talk about empathy, but I actually think what she has to say here is super relevant for the point I'm trying to get across. So what she says, And this I mean, is basically a contribution on intervention to feminist philosophy. She says, while I'm perceiving someone, I must be prepared to receive new information all the time, to adapt my actions accordingly, and to have my feelings develop in response to what the person is doing, whether I like what she's doing or not. When simply imagining her, I can escape from the demands her reality puts on me, and instead construct her in my mind in such a way that I can possess her, make her into someone or something who never talks back. And so this is where, I think the question of empathy and empathic openness might show its relevance. I mean, as I highlighted in my phenomenological kind of presentation, empathy for the phenomenologist is very much about preserving the difference, preserving and appreciating the difference between self and other, rather than, again, assuming that I, on the basis of my theoretical knowledge, or I, on the basis of my imaginative capacities, already know what is good for the other. And so, I mean, approaching the other, again, empathically, is also, also involves a certain stance of humility. I mean, there's a task there about coming to understand the other, and one important, precondition here is to also let the other speak in his or her own voice. So that would be one way of emphasizing the empathic, why the empathic face-to-face encounter is possible. And and this then brings me to the kind of conclusion of the argument that when talking about empathy training, again, the idea would not so much be a question of suddenly acquiring skills we didn't already have. It's more about learning to actually use and rely on those skills in the everyday interaction, rather than simply assuming, okay, that's another, I don't know, patient with I don't know, whatever. Sorry. Well, I mean, with whatever typical illness you can have, and so this is just, again, yet another of the 2,000 patients I've already seen with that specific illness. So probably he or she has to be treated in exactly the same way as all the previous ones, rather than understanding that offering proper health care is also about offering health care that is relevant for the person in the specific situation he or she finds him or herself in. And I mean, I think, of course, if we're dealing with acute medical treatment, I mean, okay, it's not about if somebody has broken his or her leg. I mean, there's probably not that much to talk about. But if it's about chronic illness, learning how to live with specific, changed life conditions, I mean, I think the issue of actually trying to be sensitive to and receptive to the wishes and interests of the patient is absolutely crucial for offering proper healthcare. So to conclude, I try to make the case that empathy is not sufficient for morality, but the fact that it's not sufficient doesn't mean that it's not relevant. As I already pointed out earlier, I think without empathy, our moral life would look very different. And I also think that the criticism we find in Bloom and Buber and Willerslev, I think it lacks both novelty, because these are partly points that have been made in the literature long ago. I also think it lacks pertinence. I mean, the fact that empathy is not already necessarily pro-social has been made long ago. I mean, again, Scheler made the point 100 years before the publications of Buber and Willerslev and Bloom. But as I also have argued, I mean, I think this is perhaps the most important point. I mean, one objection is that they haven't engaged sufficiently with the existing research literature. That's one objection. But I also think, and that was what I was trying to cash out in these last slides, that there's actually some very important features of empathy and of the relevance of empathy that they tend to have overlooked. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Zahavi. I think we have very much enjoyed your presentation. And of course, one problem that a good presentation poses is that it allows for a lot of questions. That I want to make a very short comment or a couple of comments about what we have already heard. If I may read it, maybe. I'd like to start with some general remarks about the presentation and about the way the critics have addressed the problem of empathy. What strikes me first is the utterly uncritical use by the critics of the concept of empathy. They rely on a, I would say, common sense notion of empathy without questioning its reliability. Now, I was curious and I compared how is it in Spanish, very briefly. No, empatía, that's the usual word, translating Einfühlung on empathy. And what the Royal Academy of the Language in Madrid says is something like, no, it's not here, it's here. Sentimiento de identificación con algo o con alguien. It's a feeling of identification with something or someone. It's crystal clear. That corresponds. But it also, I think, corresponds with the everyday use of the word. Even in Spanish. When you say you empathize with someone, you are saying something much like in the way of either Willerslev, Urban, or Bloom. And I think the problem here is that they consider, without questioning its reliability, is the first problem. The second problem is they present the problem in what I would call a third-person perspective. While empathy is, above all, a first-person experience, or if you wish, a first and second person experience, not a third-person experience. So we look out, so to speak, from the outside, no, from above, and not from the inside. So that's what I think I can draw from your criticism. But also, they also consider, and this leads me to another question, the question of method in philosophy, because they are, well, anthropologists, philosophers, they are thinkers, and they have a method and way of approaching. And I think that's the second problem is this. No? I think Husserl's insistence on this epoche and the phenomenological reduction aims precisely to avoid such a blunder as they do. So they take care of not considering things the way they usually are presented, the way we in advance think that they are so and so characterized. But we have to suspend our judgments, suspend our prejudices and everything, and look at the phenomenon itself. That's what phenomenology means, after all. And I think they, of course, do not do that. And then I have to very, very briefly consider some other aspects of empathy. Relying above all, that's my fault, I confess, drawing on Husserl. Empathy is not imagination, it's clear. But in Husserl terms, it is a presentification, a Vergegenwärtigung, that's the word he uses. It does not project anything, but intends a horizon of sense, motivated by the actual face-to-face encounter. And then it's open to possible continuations. So by the same token. And now I have a question for you. Is this horizon the basis for what you call empathic openness? Just by the end of your presentation. Second, for Husserl, empathizing means seeing the others as others in the full-fledged intentional manifestation, which you already point out. Theoretical, practical, evaluative, affective. It covers all aspects of human life. So these presentations are also reductionist in a certain way. They're reduced either to a transport to the person, either or to a sentimental vibration together, or something like that. And in any case, it's more than that. It's not exactly that, and it's more than that. But now there's another question here. What about animal empathy? What about empathy with animals? Of course, the fourth question is empathy in animals, among them. But the first one, between animal and us. I remember at one point Husserl describes what it would be like to fly like a bird. It's a late manuscript from the 30s. The earth does not move, no? Die Erde bewegt sich nicht. And Stein also mentions something like that. And then a second question I added this morning, empathy is then the basis for animal compassion. You mentioned the word compassion today. Third, empathy for Husserl and Stein has levels, from the most elementary analyzed here up to the forms of societies, institutions like nations, churches, the state, and the like. Empathy as comprehension of bodily feelings and movements. Then empathy as a grasping of the psychic and spiritual life. It's the first moment in empathy which is bodily, because the body is the first appearance that the other presents to me. But this is only the first level. After I recognize the other as a body, which is not merely an inorganic body, a mere body, but a body that has a behavior that does something or this or that, and so on, then I can step up to another level, which is a psychic level, over the mere bodily level. But then you have, of course, the intersubjective connections, and so on. So at different levels. And to end with this, empathy is necessary for the constitution of the world as an objective world, so a world for everyone, not for me alone. It is, as you said, a two-way or bidirectional relationship in which the other contributes to the formation of a world for everyone by providing me with senses I could possibly never have acquired myself. So in this sense, empathy is also the basis for not only intersubjective communication, but for the formation, the constitution, also says, of a common world, natural and also spiritual, in both senses. Well, then I shut up.
Okay, so I mean, let me perhaps start with the last question. I mean, I totally agree. I think one way, perhaps to illustrate one example that could be given to illustrate this would be something as simple as joint attention. I mean, the fact that we notice, I mean, joint attention again is not just about me attending to something and you attending to something in parallel. It's about us being aware that we are currently both attending to one and the same object. I think that capacity, the capacity to recognize that somebody else is attending to something, I think it's very much an embodied, it's very much, guided by bodily expressivity. I think it's very much a question of empathy, but I would precisely agree. And of course, I mean Husserl would argue like that. I think Tomasello would argue like that. Joint attention is also, the first move in trying to establish a shared world, a world common for us all. And the issue, the reason why objectivity becomes crucial here is that, again, Husserl would argue that it's one thing for me to have a certain experience of an object as persisting, as identical in a variety of different experiences. But that object will be apprehended by me as having a completely different sense of objectivity the moment I recognize or realize that it's an object, that it's also an object for other people who can attend to it. And Husserl has this funny example where he's saying that if that should I be prevented from sharing. Well, should I be in a situation where nobody else can see the objects I think are there, and if I persist in claiming that they're objective, although nobody else can partake in that experience, well, at some point people will start classifying me as a pathological case. I mean, I think that is correct. So I do think the issue of objectivity and intersubjective accessibility is very crucial, and it's very hard for me to see how this process of constituting a shared world could take place were it not for empathy. And accidentally, I think it was mentioned that next Thursday, I mean, there will be this whole workshop at the Academy. My talk will actually be specifically on this question, so I will say more about that next week. Then there was the question about different levels of empathy. I mean, that's also completely correct. I mean, Husserl speaks of different levels. Stein famously also speaks of different levels. I mean, so one example or one way she cashes out those levels is in the following way. She says, well, initially I might encounter somebody, I might praise or appreciate, I don't know, the emotional state of the person I'm now observing. But it's rare that our thirst for knowledge will stop at this very low level, because typically we won't be satisfied with realizing that somebody is happy or depressed or angry. No, we want to know why they are happy or angry or distressed. We want to know what it is that they are angry or happy or distressed about it. So she speaks of, I mean, she describes this as a process where the intentionality of the person I'm empathizing with will kind of draw my attention along, so that I also start to attend to the same environment that the person is embedded within. And after then having recognized what it is that the other is happy or angry or upset about, I can then return to the other and somehow be in a possession of a richer empathic experience, because now I don't just know that the other is upset. I also have an understanding of what it is that he or she is upset about. So she describes, so I mean, this is one way she describes these different levels. I have talked about that in the book Self and Other, which really contains the most extensive discussion of empathy that I have given. I've also talked occasionally about that in terms of the what, the that, the what, and the why. I mean, it's one thing to recognize that somebody is minded. I mean, sometimes we might also, we recognize that, well, there's somebody there, but we're still unsure about whether the person in question is having one emotion or another emotion. But I mean, we have a very clear experience of mindedness. So that's the that. Next step is the what. I mean, so what kind of state is the other in? And a further level is the why. So why is it that the person is happy or distressed? And so, I mean, again, social cognition can kind of go through a number of different kind of dimensions. So I agree with all of that. The one slight problem I have is that, and you pointed that out, I think, in your question, is that sometimes Husserl and Stein, I mean, they don't merely talk about empathy vis-a-vis individuals or empathy vis-a-vis groups of people who are co-present. They also sometimes talk about, I think I found a passage where Husserl talks about, having empathy with Aristotle, which, I mean, or having empathy with a foreign community. And I have to say, I'm a little bit, I find that a bit awkward because, I kept insisting upon empathy being characterized with this here and now presence. And it's just unclear to me, if I'm trying to, put myself in the shoes of Aristotle, how should empathy in that relation be different from imaginative perspective taking? So I think talking about empathy vis-a-vis people who are long dead, or talking about empathy vis-a-vis, nation states, and that just seems to me a derived or somewhat parasitic use of the term. So I would prefer to kind of keep that slightly more restricted, use of the term, because otherwise I think some of the distinctions I've been at pains to kind of carve out, they somehow start to be broken. Then there was the issue of animals, and of course, as you know, Husserl sometimes talks about other humans somehow being the starting point, paradigm case, where animals who are very different from us in terms of bodily comportments are somehow approached empathically by way of or by derivation from the human case that we are most familiar with. Sometimes, here, so you of course said that you wanted to somehow restrict yourself to Husserl, because I think I'm sometimes wondering whether Scheler might not be useful here, because he talks about a certain basic capacity for expressive understanding. So again, can't you just see, if the dog has been run over by a car and it whimpers, don't you see that it's in pain? To what extent does it involve a modulation from the human central case? I don't know how convincing I find that. And of course, Scheler is famous for also having talked about empathy, not just in, well, he actually doesn't use the term empathy, but that's a slightly different discussion. But he also talks about understanding of plants. So this might at first strike us as very strange. How are we supposed to be, somehow understanding, the inner life of plants? But the example he gives is this. Is the plant that hasn't had any water and that is completely kind of, it's deprived of vitality, and when you then water it, of course you could, again, you could wonder, is this just a total projection? But I just wanted to mention that actually some phenomenologists who even want to go one step further. But then I also thought it was an interesting question about what about inter-animal empathy, because of course there's all kinds of social communication occurring between animals. And again, one relevant question would be, well, what kind of cognitive resources are they drawing upon? Are they really engaging in imaginative perspective taking or abductive inference? I find that a bit difficult to square. So I think this idea of expressive understanding as constituting a very fundamental level of intersubjective understanding. I think it would have some potential also in the case of inter-animal kind of relation. Then there was the question about the horizon and about presentification. So that's a slightly, this gets us into a slightly technical discussion, because you are of course completely right that Husserl does not normally talk about empathy as being perception-like. He talks more about it as being imagination and recollection-like, because he talks about it as a form of Vergegenwärtigung. Again, I have a long discussion in Self and Other about how to understand this, and I personally think that there is a certain tension in Husserl's work, because sometimes he talks about empathy as a presentification. And I think that the main reason why he does that is because he doesn't want to commit to the view that we have the same access to other people's mental states as we have to our own. And he takes the instance of our own self-awareness as the kind of prime example of a presentation. And so anything that doesn't live up to that will then have to have a different term. And I can kind of understand, I mean, I can very much understand why he doesn't want to say that my access to my own mental life and my access to other people's mental life is of exactly the same kind, because I think that would have dramatic and very unfortunate consequences. But I think he should have made a different move at that stage, and he should have said that different regions have their own, if you will, presentation conditions. So we shouldn't use my own consciousness and my familiarity with my own consciousness as the kind of litmus or as the measurement for what counts as a presentation. Because I do think that when I'm seeing somebody, I don't know, screaming of pain or crying for help, I mean, I think that's the most original way the other's consciousness can be given to me. So I think it has a certain, I mean, it does provide a certain, it deserves to be called a kind of presentation. So of course it's not self-presentation, it's other presentation, but it's very different from, again, me just imagining what the other might be like. And I think talking of empathy as a Vergegenwärtigung a little bit risks glossing over the difference between the immediacy of empathy and certain other more derived, mediated forms of other understanding. So that was just a long way of saying that of course I acknowledge that Husserl talks about empathy as a Vergegenwärtigung, but I have some doubts about it. And I think perhaps the reason why he opted for that was in order to avoid a certain misconception. But I just don't think that Vergegenwärtigung was the best way of solving that problem. I mean, because I think it raises other problems of its own. And then there was the question about the horizon and the issue of openness. And of course, I mean, as I also said at the meeting last week, I mean, I think all forms of intentionality are horizontally embedded. So of course, the horizon plays a role. But I would also be a little bit reluctant in saying that the openness primarily has to do with the horizontal, possibilities, because I also think there is something overwhelming in that here and now presence of the other's experience that again blocks or ought to block. I mean, all my prejudices about what the other ought to feel or think or believe. I mean, so I think the openness I primarily have in mind is precisely, leaving or letting the other have a perspective and voice of his or her own, and letting me, it's about being open to that also in the here and now, and it's not just about, being open to what might happen later on or in terms of kind of horizontal possibilities. I think that kind of, yeah.
Well, very fine. We could go on with this discussion maybe forever, but we have, I think, limited time. So I would like now to listen to the public, probably Professor Zahavi too. So we are now open to questions. I will say that in Spanish. Les voy a pedir que los que hagan preguntas, si se acercan al atril, por una cuestión de micrófonos, si no, no queda grabado. Please.
Hi, hello, everyone. Thank you, Dan, for coming from so far and talking about such an important topic, which is very important for today's world, empathy. I have two questions and maybe one disagreement. First, speaking about New Testament, and one of the most famous philosopher and maybe psychologist, Jesus Christ, and his apostles, do you agree that New Testament is one of the best examples of different kind of empathy and sharing? Then I'm nervous. The second question would be, I heard this phrase that egoism and pride are considered the roots of all the defects, human defects. For example, let's see the wars today. And on the other side, love and charity are actually the roots or maybe objectives of all the virtues. If you agree with that. And my third question would be, my grandparent, I'm from Ukraine. I never knew my grandparent, my father's father. But we spoke with my father, and he told me that he came back from the Second World War in 1947 because he had to go to Manchuria, to China. And then he was very harsh with my father and the children. And the other day I was thinking, the Second World War was over, but was it over for him? And that is why he was so harsh with my aunts and uncles. So I never knew him, but I suddenly felt some very deep empathy for him. So these are three questions. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, so I mean, they are not so easy for for different reasons. So I mean, I should start out by saying that I'm basically of Jewish heritage. So I mean, getting a question about whether the New Testament is the best example is a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I mean, so I think I will just pass that specific question if you allow me. The second question, I mean, I think I would probably be a little bit skeptical about attempts at making very strong claims about hierarchy of emotions and whether one can explain everything by certain emotions and I mean everything bad just by looking at two emotions and everything good but just by looking at two emotions, because I mean there's a whole network of emotions, and I mean making claims about how they are all interrelated I think really demands very serious philosophical work. So I would be a bit, I mean, I would like to see what the arguments are if people are making claims like that, and I mean, why exactly highlight those, I mean, pride and egoism. I mean, why, I don't know, what about hatred and cruelty and whatever? I mean, can they somehow be reduced to, or, carried back to egoism and pride? And it's not completely obvious to me how that should happen. So I think more. I mean, again, I'm just to some extent not really answering your question, but I just think from my philosophical sentiment, I mean, making strong claims like that would always make me a little bit nervous, and I would say, what exactly is the argument supposed to be? Now, as for your last question, I mean, I think to some extent, I think I would agree with your description of what is probably happening in your I mean, the situation or the existential situation of your grandfather, that at least the effects of the Second World War, I mean, it might have been over as a kind of concrete war, but the effect certainly, continued, and that, I mean, that strikes me as being very plausible. I also understand what you are saying when you're saying that the moment you realized that, you somehow felt a different understanding or different kind of connection with him. I guess the only question would be, I mean, and this brings us back to the definitional question, I mean, is it really empathy? I mean, because again, I mean, well, as I've said many times, people are defining the terms differently. So I like to stick to this idea of the here and now presence. And I just don't think that would be a correct description of the connection you felt with him the moment you had that realization. I don't think you had the experience of his, I don't know, despair as here and now, contrary to what would have happened had you actually been able to face him in living life and engage with him. So I mean, I'm not at all wanting to dispute that the psychological reality of the connection you felt, but perhaps we should also not overlook to what extent, again, imagination and perspective taking can in various ways, broaden our horizon and perhaps suddenly make us realize or understand people better. I mean, I'm not at all trying to dispute that, but I just think again that from a first person point of view, there is a difference between doing that in the absence of the person you are trying to understand, which of course was the case with your grandfather, and understanding somebody else in their bodily present, where the here and now presence of their psychological life is also given with a certain salience.
Sorry, another one. Thank you very much, Dan. But actually, it's based on empirical, on experience that I had with one person who came from Malvinas War and who, like, the war finished, but that person was seeing shadows. For that person, when the lights were off, for that person, that person is affected by the war, and the war didn't finish. So when I saw that person, I knew him, then I felt empathy, and then I thought about my grandfather and transferred that.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, but I guess the question I would just push back to you would be, do you think that there was a difference between the relation you had to the person, the friend you had that you met in person? That, I mean, was there a difference between your grasp of his despair and your grasp of your grandfather's despair? And I mean, I just think, I mean, it seems obvious there must be some relevant differences there, and that's what I'm trying to highlight. Whereas if you were to say, well, it's empathy in both cases, it's a bit like saying, well, there's no relevant difference between those two cases, and I would just find that a bit surprising. I mean,
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is about between these two different empathy definitions. What about empathy as a action trigger and a decision making, not only for individuals but also for large groups of people? And in that sense, empathy is related to some other values. I mean, probably you will trigger an action if you see an empathic process with some injustice or some other thing. And in that sense, probably empathy is not trainable or not teachable, but the values are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I hear what you are saying. I guess that I mean, I think I could say two things initially, at least. I mean, the first is that I don't really think that this action triggering part is very important to the phenomenologists. I mean, that doesn't seem to be what they are mainly focusing on. And of course, you could then say, well, that's a problem for them. But at least I think that when trying to explain, you know, the kind of different options, I mean, well, your proposal should really be mentioned as a fourth candidate. Then, so I think, so I mean, to put it differently, if one were to accept what you are saying, I think one implication would be that one would then have to start, you know, assessing what the phenomenologists have said in a somewhat more critical fashion, because there seemed to be something that they were missing. I mean, I guess. I mean, do you have specific empirical work in mind? I mean, I assume no, you don't. Okay. Because I guess the question. I mean, the question would be whether the action triggering. I mean, does that flow? I mean, that would be one, I guess, question to ask. I mean, does that really flow automatically from empathy, or are we dealing with, you know, a supplement or an extra ingredients that perhaps in many cases are actually present, but where this is really something additional happening rather than merely the empathy. And I mean, because I guess I think there is this. There's this Danish philosopher called Løgstrup who actually talks about. I mean, I think he's increasingly being recognized, and people are drawing certain, you know, links between him and Levinas. And Løgstrup has this idea of the ethical demand that, you know, we might see certain situations and they immediately trigger specific responses from us. So I mean, one famous example he mentions is about a child that is somehow, you know, I don't know if he's just walking on a well, on the rim of a well, or he's already falling into it. But again, where, you know, the normal thing to do would, of course, be immediately to try to save him, and not, you know, first to recognize, well, he's in a bad situation, and then, you know, having all kinds of further thoughts along the way. And the question would then again be, well, I mean, if there is that inclination very fundamentally, well, is it simply empathy, or is it empathy plus something more? And how should we describe the situation of those who do not react in that way? I mean, is it because there's something wrong with their empathy, or is it because the empathy is actually working well enough, but there are certain other, you know, dimensions that are somehow not working well? I mean, I'm a little bit, you know, walking over, because I don't really know exactly how to respond, except for recognizing that it seems like a relevant point, but there's at least many. I mean, there are many of the standard discussions of empathy that does not really, you know, bring that specific element in. And of course, I mean, but I think this is also all controversial questions, because you said that if this is right, I mean, then it's not really something that can be learned. It's more about the values that could be learned. And that, of course, I mean, it seems to evoke this idea of an original, you know, that the infant originally is somehow moral, you know, and then perhaps, you know, there can be perversion of that. I mean, when society starts to interfere, I mean, then we can see all the bad effects. I mean, it sounds almost a little bit like Rousseau. but again, you know, I'm not working in moral philosophy despite the title of my talk, and so it's a little bit again outside my comfort zone. So I think I can't really offer much more than what I've said so far. But I appreciate the question.
Hi, thank you for your talking. I really learned so much, and sorry if my English is elemental, but I want to ask how empathy turns into responsibility because of the other. Because you give me an example, like my friend broke with his wife, and okay, I have through empathy that knowledge. He's bad, he's not feeling good. But how this knowledge turns into, okay, I have to make something because I love my friend and I feel sorry for my friend. I feel a pain for my friend, and how this knowledge turns into, okay, I do something. I talk with him, I give him hope. This.
Sure. Yeah, but it's kind of related to the previous question. But I think that, you know, I mean, I think if I were to kind of articulate the standard phenomenological, you know, response here, I think that would be, you know, people might say, okay, we need to distinguish, you know, two different things. I mean, one is the question of how I recognize that my friend is depressed or distressed. That's one question, and what the phenomenologists would say is that one very important answer here is empathy. I mean, in one instance, empathy is precisely what can allow me to grasp that my friend is distressed or in despair. Another question is, well, precisely, you know, what kind of values do I have? I mean, do I feel compelled to help my friend? And if I want to, I mean, you know, because again, you know, can't you separate those two things? On the one hand, recognize that somebody is distressed, and on the other, you know, feeling an obligation to do something about it, to alleviate his situation. And I mean, if you want to do the latter, I mean, then again, there might be different considerations about what is the best way of doing that. I mean, is it to, I don't know, tell him how bad his ex-wife was, or finding a new girlfriend to him, or I mean, there might be different ways of dealing with the problem. But again, I think the fundamental question is, can we kind of divide up, you know, again, the recognition or the realization that X is in a certain state from a desire to alleviate that situation. And I mean, my way of understanding the classical phenomenologists is they would insist, yes, we can make that division, and so that would mean that everything, and I guess this is, I'm also still trying to reply to the previous question, that the action tendencies, whatever propels me to act on the basis of the information I have received, that is really, that will involve other capacities than merely the empathic one. So I think that, I mean, partly what your question is about is, it's not, I think, not so much about empathy. It's more about, well, how do we become, you know, moral agents? I mean, what can make us, you know, prioritize the needs of others over our own immediate needs and preferences? I think those are those are great questions, but they're not questions that I'm working on. I'm sorry. So.
Thank you very much. It was really amazing to hear you. My question is maybe continuing the other question, but more in the frame of social ontology. So what I understood is that empathy is not creating necessarily society, but it is needed for that. So what else is needed, or which is the place of empathy in creating a society? Maybe it's too wide, but
no, I understand. I mean, again, yeah. I mean, I guess. I think probably I would probably prefer to use another term than society. Perhaps I would rather talk about community, because I think I would want to say that, empathy, I mean, and especially if it becomes reciprocal empathy, that is when it's not just one-sided, me observing somebody else, but the two of us observing each other. I mean, I think that would already amount to a kind of minimal form of sociality. But I think there's a relevant difference to be made between sociality that basically involves social interaction, and then community, which I think involves a number of other things. And again, I mean, I gave a talk just a few days ago, partly discussing Husserl's view on this. But I would say that, I mean, just to mention some ingredients, because I mean, I think the full story would be a bit too much to engage with. So one question to ask would be the following. If we're talking about reciprocal empathy, I mean, we are in the first instance talking about a dyad, about two people. Normally, you would say community clearly is more than that. It's much more. And so the question becomes, how do we move from the dyadic level of interaction to a kind of a more group-based form of interaction, where we might also be influenced by, people who are actually not around. I mean, and we might identify with people who are not around, and we might start to act and think and feel and experience in ways that are considered appropriate by the community we are part in. And so I would say that in order to understand all these different elements, well, I do think that the dyad, I do think empathy is absolutely crucial. I think it is the starting point, but it certainly cannot stand alone, and we can't understand what a community is simply by aggregating dyads, or simply by having a summation of dyads, because a community simply has a completely different level of complexity. But I would then start to refer to process of socialization, taking over, taking over and internalizing values and norms that those around me take for granted. They become natural for me as well. I would refer to, obviously also to language. I would refer to the capacity not just to identify with an individual, but identify with those who share the same ethos as me, where ethos would refer values, norms, goals, traditions, customs. So I do think, I mean, clearly it's a much more complex network, but for me, I think for me, the most important question, and the question I kind of were struggling with in this recent book of mine, Being We, was really this question of how can you, on the one hand, recognize that there is an irreducibility to community, in the sense that it cannot just be reduced to a plurality of dyads, while at the same time making the case that the dyad is an absolutely crucial kind of building block. And the way I mean, the main argument that I then tried to develop in the book is that something happens in that dyadic encounter, which I go on to discuss in terms of a second personal relation or second person engagement. I talk about the IU relationship. My basic claim is that in that IU relationship, what we find there is a certain intertwining of my own self-experience and self-understanding, and my understanding of the other, and the other's self-understanding and his or her understanding of me. And as a result of that intentional intertwinement, something happens to my affective and cognitive repertoire that allows me to also start, eventually viewing myself as one of us. I mean, where the us now is not just the ones, in my concrete physical vicinity, but I can start to identify with a much larger group. And I think that in order to explain how that identification can occur, I mean, what is it that enables me to identify myself in all my concrete bodily, temporal, specificity? What is it that enables me to identify again with people who are sharing certain values and norms? And I think in order to make the transition intelligible in order to make the transition intelligible from me having an experience of myself as an here and now individual to me having an experience of myself as a member of a certain group, as one of us, as like others, as being comparable to others, I think the dyadic encounter is absolutely crucial. And so that's my way of trying to argue on the one hand that the dyad is important and it cannot just be ignored or glossed over in a process where one then gives priority to community, while at the same time, of course, admitting that the community has a number of features that goes way beyond what can be found in the dyad. So I mean, I hope that somehow at least gives you some pointers.
Well, thank you, Dan. So I've been following your work for some years now. I share your battle against social constructivism. I see your point when you argue for the primacy of individuality for intersubjectivity. But what I still can't give up is the co-originality of individuality and relationality. So so you often say that phenomenality and intentionality are the two sides of the same coin. Why can't we say that individuality and relationality are like the two sides of just the same coin? So in that sense, would you think it would be a valid path to argue for this statement? So when Husserl studies proto-empathy, wouldn't that be an argument for this co-original relationality in the self?
Thank you. Okay, so I think let me answer in two different ways. So the first way has to do with the question of relationality, because I think one important question concerns what the relationality is between. And I mean, you clearly seem to be assuming that the relationality has to be between subjects. But you could, of course, also view the relationality in a somewhat different manner. Yes, okay. But it's just that, well, if we understand it in a broader sense, where the relationality could also be understood as, pertaining to my being in the world or my intentionality, well, then, of course, I don't have any problem with it. I mean, because I would say, yes, surely, I mean, in order to understand, we need to understand intentionality. If we want to understand consciousness, we need to understand intentionality, and we can't understand intentionality without somehow getting relationality into the picture. So if it was just that, I have no problem with it. But I mean, the place where I have a problem is when the relationality is specifically meant to pertain to the social dimension. And again, I mean, I would then also say we need to distinguish two different claims, because one claim is that, I mean, to some extent has to do with I mean, you were using the term co-originality. I mean, that somehow it's not as if there's first an initial stage when we're all on our own, and then at some later stage we start having relations to others. I mean, I guess what I want to say is you could accept. I mean, well, I would say, de facto, if we're talking empirically speaking, of course you're right. I mean, of course, it's not as if, a baby is initially isolated and then it starts at some point encountering other people. That's, of course, a complete fantasy. Of course, a human child, a human infant, I mean, is nested in relationality from the very start. So to some extent, there is co-originality there. But I would just want to say that we need to distinguish that claim. We need to distinguish a claim about co-originality from a claim concerning constitutive interdependence. And it's the latter claim that I have been speaking out against. And so, what would the latter claim amount to? Well, the latter claim would amount to the view that, that what makes us subjects, or what gives us experiential being, is somehow dependent upon or conditioned by our relationship to other subjects. And it's that specific argument that I have for many years been arguing against. And of course, one main argument from my side is that if people are claiming that, if they are claiming we cannot understand phenomenality without bringing in the other, I would just say, well, give me the damn argument. Why should that be the case? Why is it that phenomenality? Why is it that the self-presentation of inner time consciousness is dependent upon other subjects? What is the argument? And I just don't see it. But I guess it's just, what was important for me was perhaps first to say relationality can mean different things. And if we're talking specifically about the social dimension, I would insist that we need to make a distinction between the claim that others are kind of co-original, in the sense that from the very start, we are embedded in relations to others as a de facto observation. We need to distinguish that claim from the claim that there is constitutive interdependent, and it's the latter claim that I'm arguing against. Yeah, but I just think, I think I would to some extent just repeat what I said. I don't know of anywhere where Husserl is saying that proto-empathy is a precondition for the primary impression, retention, protension, and temporalization. But that's the argument that one would need to come up with.
Thank you again, Professor Zahavi. My question is a totally different one, although I would like to continue this subject because, as you know, as you probably remember, this is also one of my interests and concerns. Yes. But I now would like to ask about what you say about basic empathy, that it cannot be trained because it's a basic power of the mind, let's put it that way. But one can try to remove the obstacles and the obstructions for this basic empathy to be in place, to be enacted. Can you say something about, let's put it this way, what a kind of removal of obstacles program for empathy would look like?
Yes. Yeah, no, because I think actually, thinking also very practically, if it's about, again, influencing healthcare, training, what is it precisely that is supposed to happen? And I remember some years back in Denmark, they introduced a new IT system that all medical doctors were supposed to use. And for some obscure reason, the IT system, or the kind of the program that they decided to adopt, was some American program that was based on DOS. And some of you will probably remember that DOS was the programming system we were using in the 80s. So it was a very, very old, system where you basically had, so it was not user-friendly. You basically had to, use your cursor to move between a lot of different fields and click. And why is this relevant? Well, the reason why it's relevant is that if you, in that period, I think it probably has become a little bit better now, but if you at that period went to see your doctor, what the doctor would be doing during the entire consultation would be to look into the computer screen, because he or she had to constantly go through all these things. So there were no face-to-face contact whatsoever. And I mean, you know, without having a I hope that this is not displaying some romanticized view on the physician-patient relationship, but I don't think this is conducive to a more appreciative, respectful, you know, openness to the needs of the patient. So I mean, back then, I guess the best thing to have done would have been to simply block the introduction of this damn computer system. But I mean, I think the next step would you know, would probably be to give much more resources to the general practitioners, so that they didn't need to reduce the time with the patient to this 10-minute slot where they basically didn't have time to ask any questions whatsoever, but give them much more time so they could sit with the patient, talk with the patient, you know, look at the patient, try to understand the patient. So I think these are all, fairly obvious ways of countering what I take to be a certain, you know, obstacle to the normal use of empathic skills. So I'm not trying to blame, you know, the medical profession, because I think they're doing everything they can, but it's just that the time constraints are such that there are hardly any time to see the patients. And if you don't see the patients, if you don't listen to them, what should be your chance of getting an understanding of the individual? What would be the chance of offering, you know, person-centered care if you basically never engage with them? So.
Thank you very much, profesor Zahavi. Creo que hemos tenido todas las preguntas del público. Le agradecemos mucho y a ustedes también por la presencia.
Thank you very much.